that establishment failed to bring the black man down, said an exact black man, on October 3rd, 1995. The O.J. Simpson case was a major political and racial case around the time of the 1990s, and it brought up many issues of police treatment on African Americans, domestic violence, and how much race is influenced within the justice system. And that's more of what I'm focusing on today, is how the racial influences race is very influential on the justice system. Specifically, I'm stating that racial influences tainted the O.J. Simpson trial. And this was done through historical things, historical racial influences leading up to the case, how much talk of race was within the trial, and the makeup of the jury led to a biased verdict. So starting off, I'm going to say what historical influences led up to the O.J. Simpson case. So there are many events leading up to the murder. Specifically, there was the Rodney King case. So Rodney King in Los Angeles, California, was a major event that sparked much distrust within the police department and within Los Angeles itself. When four white men beat Rodney King and they came off scot-free, that caused many riots within Los Angeles, and eventually led to much of the black community specifically to have distrust within the police department, and they would see that having a white police officer in the trial would make them more biased on distrusting that evidence or any of that testimony within the trial. Also, there was much social pressure surrounding the case on whether they should say that O.J. was guilty or whether he was not guilty. And all those social pressures made it hard to really have an unbiased view because you were forced to choose sides. In a podcast called Letter from America, a poll that was sent out had a result that 70% of whites thought that O.J. Simpson was guilty and 80% of blacks thought he was innocent. Now, I'm not really focusing on whether he was innocent or not. I'm more focusing on the social pressures and divides within the community. So having such a divide between white and black showed that race had a really major factor within the trial. And since much of the jury, which I'm going to talk about later, was black, this really made it hard for them to say, this made it really hard for them to not support their own community when it comes to the verdict that they wanted to give. So now that I talked about having what events led up to the trial and how race influenced that, I'm going to talk about what racial talks happened within the trial itself. So there was much racial debate within the trial, specifically between the prosecution lawyers and the defense lawyers. Mostly what was talked about was racial epithet. That was a major fought discussion within the trial. And racial epithet, according to opinion reasoning, was a word or phrase that is used to insult a person by referring to his race, skin color, or religion in a negative manner. And the defense side really pushed for racial epithet because a lead detective on the case, Mark Fuhrman, which was the first investigator on the crime scene, had racist tendencies, and they really wanted to show that he had racial bias against O.J. to begin with, and that was what they were pushing for the most. And the prosecution did not want the defense to have racial epithet because it would lead for the jury to be more biased against a guilty verdict, because having such an insulting word such as the N-word, which is what they wanted to bring into the case, would lead them to distrust any Mark Fuhrman's testimony specifically, and also any other white police officer that may testify in the trial. So along with having racial epithet, more specifically, they wanted to focus on tearing down Mark Fuhrman's testimony and claiming that he was tainting any evidence that was within the trial, planting evidence, or because of his racist tendencies, they really focused on wanting to bring in how racist he actually was. And having such a focus on race within the trial really took it away from the evidence that may lead to showing that O.J. really was guilty. So it kind of drew attention away from what evidence was actually there and just tried to really focus on how racial it was. So now that I showed that there was much racial talk around the case, I'm going to move on to what the makeup of the jury was and how that led to a biased verdict. So the makeup of the jury was 9 blacks, 1 Hispanic, and 3 whites. And because the case was filed in Los Angeles rather than Santa Monica, which is where the murder actually happened, it led to having a more black-dominated jury, whereas if the case was filed in Santa Monica, it would have been a white-dominated jury. And so really the prosecution not filing it where the murder happened almost caused the case to be a non-guilty verdict because of the way that the jury makeup was, and because Los Angeles has a really, like I stated earlier, really large bias against any white people, or also hate against, also really biased views on what they want. Okay. So a study showed by law professor Sherry Lynn Johnson showed in 1985 showed that black juries find that black defendants are less guilty, and the opposite is for white. So if it was a white jury with white defendants, it would show that whites are less guilty, and also the victims do matter in the case. So having a white victim with a black jury showed that they were more likely to view that black defendants are less guilty, and it was the same as for if it was reversed. Although having other people of other races did lessen how much they viewed on this, the idea that prejudice was still there was still in the back of their minds. And because now that I talked about what the jury makeup and how biased it was, I'm going to wrap up what I talked about today. So I talked about how